Go.
Okay, so first of all, congratulations on what I find to be a really solid and powerful idea, or at least the scaffold of a powerful idea. And I just want to mention that as I speak to you, I want to invite you to engage in two rules. Rule number one is don't accept anything that I'm saying until you test it for yourself to see if it works. Right? Rule number two is very similar, and that is also please don't reject anything that I'm saying until you test it for yourself and see if it works. My aim here is to help be in service to building your discernment capacity. But you have to do that work. Okay? All right.
Absolutely.
So, what I find powerful about the idea is that it's project based. The idea that what you're doing is you are grounding a capacity building process through actual hands on experience. That it's not some sort of abstract learning that folks are supposed to apply at some later date to something. Furthermore, what's powerful about it is you are inviting students to actually engage in ways that align with what inspires them, what their passion is, what they actually care about. Okay, so with all that said, let's look at the premises. So there's a couple of really powerful premises. A, that experiential learning bit, right? B, that it was collaborative, but I want to come back to that. C, that learning is individualized. So there's a D, but we'll come back to that too. So in your mind, what's the process of how it becomes individualized? So who makes those decisions in each pod? Let's start just with the pods.
Well, I can answer that.
Please, London.
Okay, so we're envisioning a future, so we don't know what that future is going to be. But I'm thinking in the future, we're each going to have our own, students are going to have their own personal AI or advisor that's going to, you know, walk them through the process of their education from when they're little to when they grow up. So I feel like that's the aspect of the individualized education, meaning that the children are moving at the pace that works for them, and they're
some sort of
interacting.
self-evaluation or some sort of self-identified interest of different aspects. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think that their ability to, their levels that they're able to interact within the system are based on competency rather than like what their age is. I just heard on the radio today that a kid created an app for diabetes and he's like 13 and everybody's using it at all the hospitals. And I'm like, what? So, I mean, kids can do stuff that, you know, we just discount them until they're 18.
Yeah.
So
that's what's powerful about your presentation. By the way, I need to talk to that kid because I'm a type 1 diabetic. I've been for 45 years now. All right. So the other piece of it, my D that I was holding, is one of the most powerful things I saw in your presentation was this idea that the experiential learning and project-based stuff is grounded in community needs and that becomes localized. So I think when I talked about this being a scaffold of an idea, it's a great start. Now, how do we actually engage the process of implementing it? So for example, where are these projects sourced? In other words, how does that decision get made? I don't think you need to answer that right now, but I think as you are working through this task cycle, you've identified the purpose pretty clearly. You've pretty much identified the products. Now the process of implementing it would be my next question. So in that same vein, I have some, I'll call them hopefully some more disruptive questions. Those were purely functional questions. Now I want to get to the core of the essence of what you're trying to do. So at least 3 times in your presentation, you emphasized solving problems or developing problem-solving capability. So what I want to ask you is, what's the difference between problem solving and manifesting potential?
Problem solving is you've already identified the problem you're trying to fix. But the other one is you don't know what you need yet. Like we didn't know we need a diabetes app until someone had the creativity to discover and create that and make it.
So Lisa, what's the value of shifting more towards manifesting potential and imaging something that doesn't yet exist, to solving a problem that's already in existence in terms of developing the capacity of our learners?
We're preparing our, I'm sorry, I'll let someone else speak if they would like, but it was preparing our students to think innovatively in the future. So it's kind of, you're coloring outside the box in your everyday life, and you're viewing things from a different lens versus that you're trying to stay within a confinement.
So that's exactly
Others
why I'm questioning problem solving.
Okay.
Problem solving, basically, if you think of a framework of our world of existence, well, when we identify a problem, we drop below the line. What do? We solve it. We come back up to the line. Right?
We don't want that. We want
no, but that's what you kept presenting. So what I'm calling you on is to use a different imagery or language than problem solving, so that you can be much clearer at the concept level, actually beliefs, philosophies, and principles level, of what is the capacity you're seeking to build. And Lisa, you just touched on it, but that would be my question. What is the capacity you're seeking to build in these students through this experiential project-based learning? And to get really clear on that, like super clear, like a one sentence statement that is so essentialized that we go, wow, I want that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So what I might suggest is, if you want to take this idea forward, which I think has much value, I would spend a significant amount of time as a group really aligning around what that core purpose is. In other words, what's the capacity you're seeking to build? Another way of asking that question is, what is the system you're seeking to transform through this particular framework of education? And that has to do with understanding that you're actually dealing with three nested systems: the individual, the collaborators with whom they are working to manifest that transformation, and then the system that you're transforming. And they're all nested in each other. And that's the one big, I would say, place in your presentation that needs work. And it's this. The whole pod idea, the question that immediately popped up right away, and I kept waiting for it, is, okay, how do we integrate these pods? So in a certain way, by breaking it into pods, you are in a way reinforcing a specialization, as opposed to understanding an integrative way of working where each of those aspects has some impact, and they all do, on the whole. So what I kept looking for is, where is it that you're working on the whole? In other words, my profession as an architect suffers deeply from 8 or 9 decades of having, and you see this in virtually every profession, where you have a set of, let's just take a building. You have an architect who designs what it looks like. You have a mechanical engineer who puts in the heating and cooling. You have the electrical engineer who puts in the electrical systems. You got the structural engineer who makes it stand up. You've got the landscape. And each one of those folks is developing their piece of the system almost in isolation. So what I would strongly invite you to do is maybe extrapolate the subpod idea into an integrative way of working on wholes by figuring out, first aligning what the system is you're trying to transform, and then at the project level, what's the project system trying to transform, and developing a means by which very clearly the pods are working collaboratively with each other, not just within each pod, so that everybody can see that we're working with a whole living system. If I make a decision about the interior, that might actually have a lot to do with how I'm ticketing, right? Ostensibly, it doesn't, might not think so, in the same way that you might not think the windows I'm selecting for this building have any impact on the size of the heating system, but they do, right? Yeah. So my question is, do you have an idea about how they would integrate? And I think that your graphics, in a way, just the way they was presented, and this is a criticism that I hope you can use to make this way more powerful to sell this idea, because I think this idea is worth selling. Even the graphics showed each of the pods as a separate entity, right? And they were all connected up to some overarching structure, but there was no nestedness of the pods. So that's really my question: is how would you seek to really develop an integrated process across the pod so that it's one whole, as opposed to just looking at the HVAC system or the windows or the structure, right? What do you think?
Yeah, well, the graphic was actually cut off. It doesn't show the whole part of it, but really we viewed it like a football team, or like any type of a team. And
Good.
within a team, you have different groups. Like you have the cornerbacks, the wide receivers, the defensive backs, and each one of those groups work with assistant teachers or assistant coaches. But at the top is the team aspect, and you're coming together at specific times to work together as a team to play throughout the process at different interviews, to play together in order to showcase what you've learned. So you're not just like, I guess, like you're in school, you're a kid, and you get together to play as a team to showcase what you're learning and what you're doing. You're not just like rolling out to the train, So it's like a team. And that's kind of how we viewed it. But yeah, you're right. I like what you said about that. But how we were trying to say it was like it's a team, and the team has assistant coaches, and there's an overall vision, but people are broken up based on what they're interested in, and then they're brought back together in the teams they play.
Okay.
Yeah.
So London, I want you to hold on to that football image for a minute, because I want to come back to it. But before I do, I want to ask the question of what's the relationship between that integrative question I just asked and the question I asked a little bit ago about what's the capacity you're seeking to build? What's the relationship between those two questions? I think it's core to your concept. So I'll let you sit with that question. Right? So I think it's the core question. So to go back to your analogy, London, do you remember a coach back in the 80s? He coached the San Francisco 49ers. His name was Bill Walsh.
Yes, sir.
Won, I believe, 4 Super Bowls. How did he do it? Well, what he did was he said to all the players on the team, your job is not to do your job. Your role
You got to know everybody else's job.
Your role in the team is to make everybody else look good, right? Your role on the team is to make it possible for everybody else to do their job well. And it's the opposite of our siloed way of working when we work on projects. So I think that's the reconciler between the integration piece and what's the capacity you're seeking to build piece. Does that make sense to you guys?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because you tipped your hat in pod number 3 diagram to service. Seems to me that service might be the second line hole in which the 3 pods exist. So you could take those 3 pods and put them in a big circle and say service, and then the larger circle around that is the community that is being served by the project. Therefore, folks, if you're talking about a democratized education, actually begin to feel like they have the capacity to make a freaking difference. That's the capacity you're seeking to build, isn't it?
Yeah, now it is.
Well, and that they have the knowledge of how to make a difference, and that they know how to make, even how to make connections within the community to learn some. I mean, to me, one of the biggest things that kids need to get from an education is how do you continually keep learning when you're done with that formalized part, So, within the aspect of this and being able, learning how do you reach out to community members? How do I meet someone who's an expert expert at this because this is what I'm interested in doing and where I want my career to go, you know, when they are done with school, and making sure that they have the opportunities to learn how to have those real world experiences and continue to make those connections too,
Bingo,
so that they
Jamie.
can make a difference.
Absolutely. And you know, if it were my presentation, I would do this. My first image would be a big circle, which would say, identify community need to build the community's viability, whatever that is. Inside that then might be a second circle of building the capacity to work collaboratively in service to making that community contribution. Inside of which then would be those 3 pods or 4, however many they are, but not as separate. They would be like a Venn diagram, they would overlap.
Yep.
And then inside of those would be another Venn diagram of the subpods. At one image would do it. You see it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So if that's the case, now we can examine process, because where do you start?
Yeah.
So think of that image. Where do you start? Do you start inside the subpod, or do you start at the
with the community.
largest circle?
You start with the community.
Start with the community.
Absolutely. You start with the system you're seeking to transform, right? Therefore, now if all those participants are engaged in a process of alignment in terms of aligning the beliefs, philosophies, and principles of the purpose of the project, it is within that folks now, this solves the other question I was asking. Within that, each individual can now be drawn to, be called by what aspect of that whole they might feel most either desirous or drawn to or capable of participating and making a contribution. That way, everybody starts to see that they have a role in the whole and actually have a voice that's actually affecting not only their little pod, but the group and the whole community. Isn't that the democratization of education?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm done.
That was good. That was good stuff right there.
Thank
I learned
you.
a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you.
So what
Yeah.
questions do you have of John?
Where have you been for the last 3 quarters? Was Dr. Gould hiding you until now?
Dr. Gould and I talk a lot.
This could have been fun over time too.
So what you may not know is Dr. Gould happens to be my brother-in-law.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
So we sit around and imbibe
Good.
adult beverages and talk about this a lot.
Mhm.
So he's
Well,
really
now that this is our last class, I'm
Yeah.
hoping to have some beverages with Dr. Gould as well and do some more talking.
So I
if
have
I
to go
got
to
to Hawaii, London, I'll bet he'd do it.
So we got to go to Hawaii, John.
Yeah. Well, I saw somebody's in Singapore.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Where we
Yeah,
go to
Courtney's in
Singapore.
Singapore.
Yeah.
Where's Courtney? Hi, Courtney. I don't see you.
She was saying her sound, there's something wrong with her sound. I don't know. She said it's kind of sketchy and disconnected. So she wrote that in the chat box to let us know.
Okay.
So
I have a
maybe she,
question. I have a sort of last question for you. It's actually less of a question. It's more, I would like to invite any reflections any of you have about just with this little 15-minute conversation, how you're thinking about this concept is shifting.
I talk too much though. Anyone else want to go first?
go for it.
I think my whole mind got flipped a little bit. I think I got caught in the weeds, like in the weeds a little bit. And so I feel like you pulled me back to like the 30,000 foot view, and then put me back down on the ground, like my feet on the ground. So I feel more, what I mean, I actually feel like it's a more of a doable thing than a pie in the sky thing now. Like I feel like you helped to, like refocus my thinking, because I think that I was in the weeds.
So London, we all do that. I catch myself at it like every 10 minutes, and that's actually being generous. And I think the reason for that is we are all the products of an industrialized educational system that teaches us about fragments, not wholes.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
of course we default to that, unless we really work hard on developing a practice of constantly trying to understand whole systems, which I think is the capacity the world needs desperately.
Well, I
Yeah.
think that through the conversation, I mean, I see when we were thinking about it, of course, we're thinking about a school, you know, like 80 years out into the future. And I think the ideas that we have, once you know, went through them with the critique, they're actually pretty solid ideas. And a lot of it is very implementable. I mean, even now. I think the reason why we cast it so far into the future, though, is because we are hoping or expectant, I guess, but I'm hoping that as we move into the future, issues around accessibility will decrease, because I think that's the one thing that, even if this is a great idea and it does democratize education, if it were implemented at this point, who is it serving? You know, it's really going to serve people and children who have access to the technology. And so it sounds like a very feasible idea to me even now. I think that the worry, though, is that if it were implemented now, it becomes something that's, you know, it's just another more, it becomes an elite thing that people can do if they can access it. And that's just a concern of mine. And that was the idea. In the future, we will have solved those problems.
Okay, so Jamie, I'm gonna push right back pretty hard on that.
Mhm. Okay.
You can't wait for those problems to be solved. I am seeing your concept as an instrument for actually transforming that system in the way you seek, as opposed to waiting for it to happen magically. And I think the key to doing that is answering your question. Who are we serving? And I think a framework that might help you with that is simply 3 concentric circles, 3 lines of work. Every individual who engages, the group with whom they are working in not only pods, but in that larger second line work of the entire team. And that's nested inside the community in which these projects are being created to build value adding processes for that community. If you can manage throughout your entire process to simultaneously hold that what you are doing is actually building capacity at all 3 of those levels simultaneously, you can't screw up.
So
That's interesting.
our also thought is just beyond also just the community. We're trying to service the world. So a lot of our discussions also dealt with, everybody right now is very neighborhood centric. So if you think about how the school systems are, you have to go to the school because this is the neighborhood that you live in. But for some of us, like my son, who we travel back and forth between South Korea and the USA, his education is constantly being interrupted because I can't get into the school system for him to continue his education. So as part of this, it would be community-based, but we're also trying to make it where, and I think now that we are in COVID land and people are finally saying, oh, I can start working from or taking school from the beach versus having to sit in the classroom because I can go anywhere. People are finally, the mindset is shifting to being a little bit more open to these creative ideas to get them to that situation.
So Lisa, to riff on that a little bit, one of my most brilliant colleagues in the world of regeneration has a very simple mantra, and that is regeneration is about the particular, which is an extrapolation in a way of all sustainability is local. And what I mean by that is being place sourced. So how you would design a train in Hawaii is very different than how you would design a train in China or New Orleans.
Absolutely.
Or Puerto Rico, right? So it being place sourced, which is really going back to Jamie's question, who are we serving? So it's not only the idea of who are we serving conceptually by the concept, but each project identifies the system that it is seeking to transform. And if it's not grounded in something local, it's just an abstract masturbatory exercise. which I think is what you're trying to get away from.
Mhm.
Right? In fact, that's what is so intriguing about your concept, is that it absolutely is concrete based, but it's trying to develop a capacity of resilience so that I now have the capacity for being able to think and learn regardless of what's thrown at me. Right? Through the instrument of a grounded concrete experience. So, guys, we all experience this in school, right? You would learn all this stuff and you kind of think, well, okay, well, that's cool. I just learned how to think, but am I ever going to use this? Well, if I realized that what I just learned was how to think, and that math problem I just did, that calculus derivative, right? I may never use that, but it was an instrument for teaching me how to think differently than I ever have before. You see the difference, right? And what you guys have done is found a reconciler for that by grounding it in project-based experiential learning, where I, as a participant, can be drawn to what I feel, the place I feel called upon to contribute, and for which I want to develop further capacity to contribute in the future. But I think that only works if we're also seeing the whole. Otherwise, we're developing a world full of specialists, which we already have, which is really part of the problem.
Sure.
So remember rule number 1 and rule number 2, guys.
No, but what you're saying has a lot of merit, because 2 years ago when I first moved here and came to the school that I'm at now, it's a small rural school, they were actually modernizing the building and had torn it down to the studs. And so all summer they had people coming in, like you said, the different silos of how they were putting this building back together. And we ended up delaying the start of school 3 times because, they put up the sheetrock, but nobody had connected, done any of the electrical work to connect the lights. And so then they had to tear out the sheetrock and they had to redo the wiring, and they had, it was just one thing after another that, like you said, they all came in and it was like, oh, well, we scheduled these people this day and these people this day, but they were not all on the same page.
And then you had fires.
All you need to do to think about this is think about how nature works. So where does the effect of a tree end? Right? I mean, it's only been in the last 20 years, 30 maybe, that we've realized that the whole forest is an organism, that all those trees, various species, are connected underground with microscopic fungal mycelia that are constant information and nutrient transfer vehicles, sending messages to all the different trees. It's not a Darwinian model at all, we now know. And if we can start to see that each of us has a role to play like that tree, by seeing that every decision I make about that interior design process has an impact on the scheduling maybe of the train or the ticketing. Now that may seem like a stretch, but if you really start to think about it, there likely is a serious relationship between those two things. And what you're then teaching and building folks' capacity is to see how reciprocal interrelationships benefit the larger whole, and how I can have a voice and a role to play in that. Because I think the tragedy of our age is that folks don't feel like they have a voice.
That's what you're saying is really, I'm using Hawaii as an example, but Hawaii is like the things that the students are learning out here have nothing to do with Hawaii. So when they graduate from college, they just leave because because they're not learning anything that relates to the community here, or that is useful in a way they can contribute here. Like everything, so as soon as they graduate, they can't, there's nowhere, nothing for them to do but to go somewhere. They leave.
So and notice that tree never leaves its place.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. And I think what it boils down to, in my mind, what I think is epistemology, which is what is knowledge. And so basically what it's saying is we're not valuing the knowledge that's here. We're saying that our knowledge, we're going to tell you what is knowledge, but we're not listening to what their knowledge is. And because of that, they no longer care about their knowledge anymore. And as soon as they get our stuff, they just want to go wherever we go.
So London, that shift alone would transform education.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a powerful lesson I learned here when I first moved here. That's definitely what's going on here. Yeah.
Yeah, that almost becomes an essential question as I'm thinking about that, that I wonder how many teachers ask their kids if they understand the culture of their community that they're part of, and that we segregate them out. And I'm thinking about in Philadelphia, if you go to North Philly or West Philly, et cetera, Drexel University's, trying to, what I call colonize the West Philadelphia area by kind of gentrifying it at the expense of the community that's there, who has a culture there, but no one's understanding that culture. So we wonder why, there's violence there. There's, there's no connectiveness because no one cares about their voice, nor do they want to try to understand the culture they live in within that.
John, I would just offer one slight shift to your question. And that is, I think those kids deeply understand their culture. It's not, do they understand it? Help me understand it.
Yeah.
Right? Draw that from them.
Yeah.
Right?
So the way I was going to jump in there, because just like London described in, Hawaii, how they're not, the students that are, in the education systems there are not necessarily learning about Hawaii. As someone who taught in Philadelphia for 20 years, as an environmental science teacher, I was bio first, environmental science second. A lot of the things our students were reading about in their books had nothing to do with our urbanized environment. And they were learning instead about rainforest, and my kids couldn't wrap their head around how that made sense to their everyday life. So when I took them out to Broad Colony and we did a field study of literally the pavement, and they marked off their section of few feet, they swore to me that there was no diversity. And let me tell you something, when we just noticed that there was weeds popping up, breaking through the asphalt. Then we noticed the insects that were there and the few birds and squirrels that came in. When we dug down deeper, and then I had them do a little back study as to when that land was actually, when they broke into that land to make the subway, that was actually the suburbs where we were, Broad Colony and Philly. They were fascinated, because then it led to a conversation as what is the function of the row house? And a lot of the row houses where we were in North Philadelphia were in service to the larger estates that, had wealthy people living there. And these young kids were like starting to appreciate, wow, these houses were people in service to what, okay, so there was a functionality to that purpose. And this land only was, farmland 50 years ago. It was so telling, and it made sense for them. They were fascinated by it. And in a place that is not known to have rich diversity exists in nature regardless, right? So making it real for them was like second nature, because that was what I was teaching. But I do believe that that's something that a lot of people just fail to miss altogether, and they just don't even think about making the connectivity. So thanks for bringing that
Emily,
up.
Was that Emily?
Yep.
So that was lovely. I think you should be assigned the role of the diversity police on this project. Just one quick story. Before I moved to New Jersey, my wife and I had a 30-acre farm in central Pennsylvania for 22 years. And for the first 10 years, I was just trying to figure out what's my role in helping be in service to contributing to the health of this land. And in order to do that, I needed to understand its role in its watershed. So in order to do that, I invited a guy by the name of Dr. Gerald Wilhelm, who is probably one of the most brilliant biologists, botanists, and Native American scholars in the US. And we became pretty good friends, and we walked around the farm for 2 days. He had developed this system where he could do an inventory of flora and fauna. So to cut the story short, after these 2 days, he showed me the results of this inventory, and what we discovered was, he was not surprised, I was stunned, was that the inventory of flora and fauna on every square meter of land relative to the adjacent square meter differed by 30%. Just think about that. I mean, I'm standing there in the field looking at this and think, wait a minute, they look exactly alike. They differ by 30%. Well, a couple months later, I was doing one of my lectures and facilitating a workshop with a bunch of marine biologists down in Newport News, Virginia. And I mentioned this little anecdote, and their eyes got real big, and they said, I'll quote them, "Holy shit, like 10 years ago, we discovered the same thing about the oceans, that every cubic meter of the ocean varies in its diversity of species by 30%. That's a pattern, right? So the idea that we can homogenize how we are doing things in isolation from the particularness of place is a destructive, in my view, abstraction. And Emily, the little story you just told made that really clear.
Yep, it's great. So guys, I am going to stop the recording, and I will send you the audio file of this and also